Greetings to everyone who has joined us. My name is Mohammad Anas Khan, and I will be your host for today's eBaithak and trophy hunting. Here to speak with us today is Catherine E. Semcer. Catherine E. Semcer is a research fellow with the Property and Environment Research Center, where her work focuses on rights and market-based solutions to policy challenges in environmental security, conservation finance, and sustainability. She is the past COO of Humanitarian Operations Protecting Elephants, HOPE, which is a boutique NGO delivering training, advisory assistance, and procurement services to African counter-poaching programs. In addition to her work with PERC, Catherine serves as a senior research fellow with the African Wildlife Economy Institute at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. She's a member of Sustainable Use and Livelihood Specialist Group, International Union for Conservation of Nature, which is ICUN, the Protected Areas Finance Working Group of Conservation Finance Alliance, among her other associations. Uh, I'd like to also add that I was also part of the Property and Environment Research Center colloquium back in summer 2019, and where Catherine was one of the faculty members. So it is indeed great to welcome her on this conversation surrounding trophy hunting. For questions during the Q&A session, we'll be sending you a link in the chat box wherein you can ask questions and also vote for your favorite question. Now, without further ado, I'd like to request Catherine to take over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you to the center for giving me this opportunity to have this conversation with you today. As Mohammed mentioned, I am a research fellow with the Property and Environment Research Center. The Property and Environment Research Center is a US-based think tank that is the home of free market environmentalism. Broadly, we look at how rights and market-based solutions can be delivered to some of the most pressing conservation challenges facing our world today. And the conservation of wildlife is certainly one of the most pressing challenges that we face as a global community. The IPBES has warned that we are in danger of losing 1 million or more species in the near term unless we take significant steps to conserve habitat and ecosystems around the world. And that is part of what led me to become a researcher on the subject of trophy hunting. The other thing that led me to become a researcher on this topic, though, is something Mohammed mentioned, my past affiliation working with counter-poaching units in Africa. With HOPE, Humanitarian Operations Protecting Elephants, we had footprints in Zimbabwe and Mozambique, two southern African nations, very different in their histories, very different in the way that they've pursued wildlife management. But one thing that they have in common is the use of trophy hunting to conserve their wildlife. And, our organization worked primarily with the hunting outfitters in that country to improve their counter-poaching programs, both in terms of capability and capacity. And that was where I really started to develop an understanding of the important role that trophy hunting can play in the conservation of wildlife in Africa, but also other places around the world. I should note that I am not a trophy hunter. I have never hunted an animal, for a trophy, but I have hunted for food in the past, and I share that just in the interest of academic disclosure. I should also note that I don't receive any funding for my research from any trophy hunting groups. That is not a compromise, that has influenced my work in any way. So I like to believe that what I'm going to share with you today is an honest opinion and an unbiased opinion of the subject of trophy hunting. Now, what is trophy hunting? Trophy hunting, in short, is the killing of an animal on a sustainable and a selective basis for its unique qualities. It differs in many ways from other forms of hunting, which can be indiscriminate and can kill large numbers of animals in the process. Now, trophy hunting is not a new invention. There's a number of academic papers out there that argue that trophy hunting is an outgrowth of colonialism. I would argue that that is not true. Perhaps the name trophy hunting is, but not the activity. If we look at the indigenous tribes of North America, they would often kill animals in order to acquire their claws or their skins, and those artifacts would be worn as a source of pride and be used by warriors and shamans and others as a demonstration of prowess. Similarly in Africa, if we look at the Maasai, there's a tradition there of warriors killing lions and wearing the skins, again, as a sign of prowess. And these are forms of trophy hunting, and the taking of animals, particularly dangerous animals, has very long and very deep roots in human history. And so I would say that, saying that this is a recent phenomenon is just, not an accurate reading of the facts. Now, that said, in Africa, trophy hunting did rise to the prominent level that we see it today, with the colonial interventions by the United Kingdom and others into countries. What oftentimes happened was settlers, would pursue animals, particularly, animals like elephants, with ivory holding commercial value, and rhinos, and other species, as an extension of the type of hunting that occurred in Europe up to that time for stag and roe deer and sika deer and other species. And one of the unfortunate byproducts of this was that wildlife, became the possession of the white, colonial settlers, and the indigenous people, of Africa were often, separated from the wildlife that they had, always lived with. For a good examination of this, I recommend the book White Hunters, Black Poachers, which examines this phenomenon in Kenya. But as African nations began to shed the shackles of colonialism and find their independence, which is relatively recent, in the context of things. We're only talking in the last 50 to 70 years that this independence has occurred. One of the things that they retained for the most part, with some exceptions, was the use of trophy hunting as part of conservation management strategies. This is particularly prevalent in the Southern African Development Community, but also in East Africa and some West African nations as well. And they've modified the system a bit, brought it more into a regulated structure. And if we look at what those structures are, the primary defining feature is that they've reinvested African communities in the health and the fate of their wildlife populations. And they've done this through something called community-based natural resource management. And what community-based natural resource management does, CBNRM, is give local people, rural people, an economic stake in the health of their wildlife populations. Now, this can come in any number of ways. The Campfire program in Zimbabwe, Campfire being the communal areas management program for indigenous resources. Under that system, wildlife remains owned by the state. It is not private property. But what the state does is give these communal areas use rights over the wildlife within the area that they live in. And what they can do with these use rights is varied. They can use them themselves to put meat on their own table, as they would, traditionally. Or what happens more often than not is they lease those rights to a hunting outfitter. And in the process of leasing those rights to the hunting outfitter, they achieve a couple things. One, the leases always involve some type of revenue sharing agreement. So the local communities are getting a share of the revenue of the hunts that the hunting operator sells, typically to foreign tourists, typically to Americans. They're getting the actual cash payment, for leasing those rights as well. But they're also getting the meat that comes from the animals that are harvested. There's, I think, a misperception out there that trophy hunting involves going out into the bush, killing an animal, cutting off its head, leaving the carcass to rot, and washing your hands of the whole ordeal after that. And that's not just the reality. That's just not the reality. Um, this is hard for, I think, a lot of Westerners, at least, to understand. But, in Africa, people do eat elephant, they do eat giraffe, they do eat zebra, and a whole host of other species. So there's, a cascade of economic benefits to rural communities that come from trophy hunting, and continuing with the Zimbabwe example. The money that comes in, from those leases and from those revenue sharing agreements, some of that goes out into direct cash payments to households. We know in the campfire area that since trophy hunting was introduced, household incomes have risen as much as 15%. But almost more importantly than that, revenue sharing with households is what starts to happen in terms of community transformation. And this has some significant impacts for the current pandemic that we're currently in. The money that comes in from trophy hunting is used to provide things like basic sanitation. We know in this pandemic the importance of washing one's hands. Now imagine if one didn't have clean water to do that. Sanitation projects have been a priority for the revenues derived from trophy hunting within the campfire areas. Similarly, the construction of medical clinics have been funded, through trophy hunting revenues. And these medical clinics, one, give people who might live hundreds of miles away from the closest hospital access to immediate healthcare should they get sick. But more importantly, in a global context, they serve as the early warning system for new disease outbreaks and possible new pandemics, when they do emerge. So there's a lot of important ripples that come from the presence of trophy hunting in these areas. There's also a security aspect. The poaching of elephants and rhinos has been something that's captivated global attention since 2008 at the very latest. And what we've seen happen in Zimbabwe is trophy hunting revenues being reinvested into community-driven anti-poaching efforts. And the impact, of these anti-poaching programs has been that Zimbabwe now has the second largest elephant population in all of Africa, more than 82,000 animals. In some places, they've even grown overabundant, beginning to outstrip the ecological carrying capacity of the habitat that they have available. And that's a challenge that Zimbabwe is going to have to work out and is beginning to work out by starting to move some of those animals to Mozambique. Now, Mozambique has a slightly different system than Zimbabwe does. Mozambique, was a country that had been devastated by decades of civil war. First was their war for independence against the Portuguese, and then they fought a civil war amongst themselves for control of the country. And with the signing of a peace deal in 1994, the opportunity to begin refocusing on conservation once again presented itself. And this was really important because the decades of war had essentially stripped the country of all of its wildlife. There was massive killing of wildlife in the country, primarily to feed the warring armies. There's stories of Russian helicopter gunships, going into some areas and just slaughtering thousands of Cape buffalo at a time in order to provide food for some of these armies. So it was quite a devastating situation. Now, Mozambique does not have a communally managed system like Zimbabwe does. What they do is have state-administered hunting areas that hunting operators can lease from the state. And the way I look at it is every hunting operator is an entrepreneur. These are people who are putting cash on the table and taking a personal risk to become stewards of an ecosystem. And one of those ecosystems that provides a really compelling story, I think, is Katada 11, which is in the lower Zambezi River Valley, in the what's called the Maramu ecosystem. And Katada 11 is roughly the size of Yellowstone National Park, all things considered, little over 2 million acres. And a gentleman named Mark Haldane, who's a professional hunting operator from South Africa, took over management of Katada 11 from the Mozambican government in 1994. And as with much of Mozambique, it was completely devoid of game for all intent and purposes. Mark stepped up, saw the opportunity there because while the game was gone, the habitat remained. And so he started where he was and he invested in what he had. And he put money on the table to start funding a private anti-poaching unit. This is one of the anti-poaching units that I worked with when I was working with Hope. And over the years, through a combination of anti-poaching and habitat stewardship, the wildlife slowly began to return. Over time, he went from fewer than 2,000 Cape buffalo to more than 21,000, from 44 sable antelope to more than 2,500. And he's managed to maintain this success by reinvesting the revenues of his trophy hunting operation into wildlife conservation. This has expanded beyond anti-poaching and habitat management to creating alternative livelihoods for poachers in the area, so that that they don't feel the need to go in and kill these animals on a grand scale. These alternative livelihoods include everything from crop agriculture to fish farming, and like other trophy hunting operations, the locals, of course, get a weekly drop of meat from the animals that are killed by trophy hunting clients. This has been, a wonderful success story of ecological restoration, and would not have occurred, were trophy hunting not, part of the landscape in Mozambique. Now, if we go to the southwest in South Africa, it's a different system altogether. In South Africa, the majority of the land is privately owned. And thanks to South Africa's decision to allow wildlife to become private property, what we've seen is the conversion of 50 million acres of former cattle ranches back to wildlife habitat. And what these ranchers, have done is make their land profitable by growing wildlife. And this wildlife is primarily used to fuel the trophy hunting trade, primarily for American clients. And it's not just providing habitat for, some of the species favored by hunters, be it, zebra or rhino, elephant, what have you, but also a lot of endangered species. The waterberg blue butterfly, for example, is recovering almost entirely on these private game ranches that service the hunting communities, the community. There's an endangered species of tortoise that is similarly recovering only on these hunting ranches. But most impressively is the recovery of the southern white rhino. Thanks to hunting and the private ownership of wildlife in South Africa, we've seen rhino numbers go from a low of, maybe around 800 animals, in the late 1960s to around 20,000 animals today. And this is, almost exclusively because landowners understand that they can make a profit selling rhino hunts to foreign clients, and that they can make money, doing that, more money than they could raising cattle, and they can then reinvest those funds into the conservation of the lands that they steward. Now, unfortunately, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, many of these operations are now in jeopardy. They're looking at a complete lost season because of their reliance on American clientele and the fact that there's travel bans in place and also reduced consumer interest in traveling internationally. Now, one of the common, retorts to everything that I've just, put on the table is that, well, couldn't we replace this with phototourism? And I think that the evidence, shows that no, we couldn't, at least not in most cases. If we look at, the South African examples, the revenue that comes in from trophy hunting is significantly larger than the revenue that comes in from phototourism. By an order of, up to tenfold, depending on which landowner you're talking about. If we look at Namibia to the west of South Africa in Zimbabwe, there was a study published by researchers from the World Wildlife Fund that appeared in the journal Conservation Biology, which found that should you remove trophy hunting from the communal conservancies there, better than 60% of those conservancies would no longer be financially viable. Phototourism just does not bring in the revenue at the local scale that that trophy hunting does, and this is due to a number of factors. But the main factor is that the areas that are utilized for trophy hunting tend to often be very remote, oftentimes can be very dangerous for travel, and lack the kind of infrastructure that phototourists want. The roads, the easy access to airports, the luxury lodges, etc. So phototourism is not really a viable, alternative for many of these areas that are currently used for trophy hunting. And we're seeing some of that play out in Kenya. Kenya has decided to not use trophy hunting as a conservation tool. And I would argue that that is their right. They are a sovereign nation and they have a right to make decisions for themselves about what is best for them, their people, and their wildlife. But since, Kenya banned trophy hunting in 1977, we've seen declines of relatively common species across the Kenyan landscape, declines of up to 89%. In some cases. And this is very troubling. And I'm not going to suggest that Kenya should, adopt trophy hunting as a conservation model. I think there's cultural barriers as well as political barriers to doing that. And I think those cultural barriers should be respected. But it certainly sends a signal that phototourism alone is not enough to conserve wildlife at scale. You really need a diversity of approaches, which is something that many of the Southern African countries have pursued. In the Kenya example too, what we see is that there's a lot of competition between wildlife and agriculture. Phototourism is just not able to compete on price with agriculture in Kenya. Typically the Kenyan landowners who are enrolled in phototourism programs get about $30 to $40 per hectare, for keeping their land open for wildlife. Meanwhile, they can get about $100 per hectare if they use that land for crop agriculture, and between $40 and $50 per hectare if they use it for cattle production. So, unless you have a diversity of approaches, that includes trophy hunting, that includes phototourism, that includes other approaches. I think carbon sequestration programs have great potential to diversify the portfolios of these wildlife conservation systems. It's going to be really hard to prevent the level of extinction that the IPBES has warned us about. I know that we're closing in on the half hour, so I'll just summarize this by saying, if we look at the African landscape, trophy hunting conserves more than twice as much land as the national park system in Africa. It conserves about 6 times as much land as the US national park system. That's about 2 million plus square kilometers, a little over 510 million acres. And I think that this is a fact that can't be denied, just like we can't deny the fact that trophy hunting and phototourism are not diametrically opposed. Rather, they're inseparable partners in delivering conservation in Africa. But this is a moral issue as much as it is an economic issue and a scientific issue. And if people want to debate the morality of trophy hunting, I think that that's a worthwhile debate to have. But I would say in the context of that debate, we really need to consider what are the moral implications of ending trophy hunting. We might find it personally morally repugnant that a few lions are killed each year in a country like Tanzania by wealthy Americans, wishing to show that their prowess, much like their ancestors did. But the alternative might be seeing 100 lions or more die very slowly and painfully in the snares laid by poachers. Is that a more moral outcome? I'm not sure. For me, the death of 100 lions is much more repugnant than the death of a few. And I think we really need, as a global community, to think, well, what are the trade-offs? What are the second and third order effects of our attempt to create environmental policy that is not rooted in economics, is not rooted in science, is not rooted in local culture and custom, but is instead rooted, in our own sense of what is right and wrong, and ask ourselves, whether those things are right and wrong for the people and the wildlife who are most directly impacted by our decisions. And with that, I'm happy to open it up to question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. In fact, we have had quite many questions. I'll quickly share my screen, and for everyone who is yet to ask a question, you can send in your questions to the link that has been sent on the chat. I'll just request my colleagues to send it again. I'll share my screen, Catherine. Yeah, here we have questions. Can you see my screen? Are you able to see?
Now I see it. Thank you.
Yep. So things that we have, they are in order of how people have voted for them.
So I'm going to close one of my windows that's blocking the questions. Are there alternatives to trophy hunting as a conservation mechanism, which may be viable in certain countries due to their cultural conditions? Are there alternatives? Yes and no. It really depends on the local conditions. As I said a few minutes ago, many of the areas that are used for trophy hunting are not suitable for phototourism. They lack the infrastructure, they lack the access, they lack the safety and security that phototourists often demand from their holidays. What we know about trophy hunters versus phototourists is that trophy hunters tend to have a much higher tolerance for personal risk, when they visit these areas. But I think trophy hunting is an inseparable partner right now of many of the other conservation alternatives, including phototourism, but also, things like carbon sequestration, which I think has great potential in some areas, particularly the grasslands of East Africa, the veldt of South Africa. And it's not an either or question, it's a both and. It's a question of how do we put together a system that has the necessary redundancy so that it's resilient and not vulnerable to shocks, like the current pandemic we're all experiencing. I should note that, we've been through this before, during the last Ebola outbreak, which happened in West Africa. Phototourism operators in Kenya and Tanzania saw up to 70% of a decline in bookings, even though the Ebola outbreak was thousands of miles away. And conservation suffered, as a result of those decreased bookings because there was less revenue coming into the system. And had the system not been solely dependent on that one activity, phototourism, the negative impacts for conservation might have been far less. And I'm really hoping that that's the lesson conservationists, particularly practitioners, take away from the current pandemic, is that we need to stop thinking about approaches in terms of either or and pursue both and get as many revenue streams as possible into these systems so that when shocks do occur, be they health crises, violent conflict, diplomatic issues, that the systems remain resilient because they have that redundancy in them. And one of the key questions I think going forward at future World Economic Forums and other high-level discussions is how do we get more sectors, paying into conservation so that it's not solely the province of tourism, be it hunting tourism or photo tourism or any other kind of tourism or outdoor recreation, because we do have a lot of businesses that are benefiting from the services that are provided by the ecosystems in which phototourism and hunting occur. So, creating more inputs and diversifying the range of sectors that are invested, I think, is going to be absolutely key. The next question is, isn't it possible to find benefits in everything? Cascading benefits don't actually face the direct ethics of trophy hunting, but seem evasive. Nirvana fallacy. Ethics are a relative enterprise, depending on one's culture, one's environment, one's current reality. I think we should have the ethical discussion around trophy hunting, but I don't see that happening in the policy realm at the moment. People are trying to evade the ethics discussion by talking about whether or not trophy hunting actually delivers conservation benefits. I think, in terms of the research, that's a settled question. Trophy hunting does deliver widespread conservation benefits. And I think those who are denying that are very much akin to climate deniers. The science, for all intent and purposes, is settled. If we want to debate the ethics, then let's do that, but let's do it openly and honestly. And let's consider, again, the second and third order effects of our ethical choices and whether they really live up to the standards that we're trying to set. How exactly do we think of the state-administered hunting areas in places of potential civil conflict and where the community may not recognize state ownership? I think that that's an outstanding question, and one that I'm actually engaged in a research project on right now, looking at what is the interplay between civil and violent conflict and conservation. I don't have any great answers, right now to this question. I think it's a great question, and as I said, it's one I'm exploring. It's a challenge. If we look at a flagship national park like, say, Virunga, which has been a bit of a cause célèbre, in the global community. A number of rangers there were just unfortunately killed in a firefight with local rebels. And, I mourn their deaths as do conservationists around the world. But, when we look at a place like Virunga, it's important to consider the social and political and civil situation in that country and how the national park fits into that. It's not a simple situation of, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. There's a lot of baggage there and a lot of background. And I think conservationists look at these issues to their detriment and to the detriment of the species and the ecosystems that they have taken charge of. If they look at things like national parks in a vacuum, conservation does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs in a world in which people have grievances and in which people have aspirations. And that's something that I think deserves a lot more exploration than it's gotten in the past. Hopefully at some point in the future, I'll be able to send you a copy of a journal article that explores this question more deeply, because I think it's a critical question. How do we disincentivize agents who prioritize farming selected prize species unsustainably? I'm not sure I completely understand the question. I'm not sure what's meant by farming selected prized species unsustainably. This may relate to, to captive lion breeding in South Africa, perhaps. I think that one way to disincentivize, some of those practices is you work with the consumers. Consumers typically want a high quality product, and sustainability has to be seen as a mark of quality. And if you can get consumers to demand sustainability, then I think that provides a sufficient disincentive to people who want to engage in unsustainable practices. And I think we've seen that begin to play out a bit in South Africa, as the issue of captive lion breeding has become more and more a subject of discussion. Is trophy hunting viable on a global scale as a conservation tool? Apart from certain areas such as Africa, do locals not benefit from the animals hunted? I don't think that it's viable on a global scale as a conservation tool. And I don't think it's viable on a global scale as a conservation tool, primarily, due to cultural obstacles. Not every culture in this world relates to wildlife and hunting the same. And I think those differences need to be respected. Outside of Africa, I think that there is, tremendous evidence suggesting that trophy hunting does provide benefits, though, where it does occur. If we look at the Markhor program, that occurs in Central Asia, and elsewhere, it has produced tremendous benefits for both wildlife and people. The same with the Marco Polo sheep programs and the blue sheep programs. What are these benefits? They're jobs. They're reduced human-wildlife conflict or increased tolerance for human-wildlife conflict. They're economic opportunity. They're the bringing in of cash where cash was traditionally scarce. So it does have benefits outside of Africa, but again, it's not appropriate everywhere. A place like Kenya, I would not necessarily push trophy hunting as a solution, just because particularly in the southeast part of the country, there's cultural obstacles to gaining acceptance, and I think that those cultures need to be respected. It's really national and site dependent. Once you see an open trophy hunting as a conservation mechanism, does it not lead to creation of a gray area for exploitation and misuse? I think that that's true of any industry. In all industries, you will see people who bend the rules, who find unsavory loopholes, who engage in criminal activity. And we have seen this happen in the trophy hunting sector. But like any other industry, that's been cracked down on pretty quickly, whether it's at the operator level or at the hunter level. There are laws in place, and there is a sensitivity on the part of people in the industries to make sure that bad actors are held accountable. And so the fact that we know about those bad actors, that it's made the press, tells me that the system is working because it hasn't been swept under the rug. It's been exposed to daylight and dealt with accordingly. Southeast Asia / China has interest in the bile of bear, tiger bone, etc. for anti-aging health benefits. Please can we also talk on this, since hunting is also done for these? This is not something that is within the realm of my expertise, the bear bile and tiger issue. I will say that the use of rhino horn within traditional Chinese medicine has been a driving factor in the poaching of rhino in Africa, and that's been known for some time. And I think one thing that we need to look at is the fact that rhino horn is a renewable resource. You can take the horns off of a rhino and keep the rhino alive. In fact, most of the rhino breeders do this in order to limit the poaching risk of the animals that they're stewarding. We need a more serious discussion, I think, about a legal trade in things like rhino horn. Because right now these countries are sitting on a tremendous stockpile of wealth that properly managed could be used to fund social and conservation programs in their countries. And all we've done by keeping the trade illegal is essentially empower Chinese organized crime, who have taken over complete control of the trade. I'd much rather have a discussion about a trade that is legal, regulated, has oversight, and where the criminal element is decreased. Don't you think encouraging trophy hunting legally, even for economic reasons, might make it legitimate, and people may sideline the moral implications for gains? As said before, I think we should have a conversation about the morals and the ethics, but I don't see that happening in the policy realm. And I also think that we really need to consider what are the downstream effects of imposing our morals and ethics on the situation. Do we, perhaps unintentionally pave the road to hell with our good intentions? It's a conversation that we need to move on to, rather than this endless debate of whether or not trophy hunting actually provides conservation benefits or not. Do you think trophy hunting only in state-administered areas could end up bad on the environment, similar to scientific forestry? Again, I think it depends. It depends on a lot of factors. There's always going to be risk, that there's never going to be an environment in which we're operating where risk is absent. Bad things do happen. I think the key is really to make sure that the clients, the trade associations, and the overseers, are people who are able to operate in such a way that the risk is diminished. Isn't there a free rider problem when we attempt to conserve animal lives through legalization, regulation of trophy hunting? I don't think so. I think that what we're actually doing is, helping wildlife pay for itself. Trophy hunting is an industry. It is a business. And when hunting operators take over these concessions, be they in a campfire area, be they a catata in Mozambique, they're paying for this, and their clients are paying for this. No one is getting anything for free here. Conversely, if we look at phototourism, which is heavily reliant on publicly funded national parks, I think you do potentially get a little bit more into the issue of free riders, because you're seeing potentially less financial investment being made into the actual conservation system than the trophy hunting industry is having to make in their part of the sector. Is it possible to restrict trophy hunting as well as poachers in the interest of conservation? Trophy hunting is already restricted. It's one of the most heavily regulated industries that we see in the conservation sphere. First and foremost, operators have to secure license in order to take over a concession. Those licenses are typically secured by a bidding process. Once they have the license, they then have to pay license fees for each individual animal that a client takes. Then there's export regulations for the trophies. There's import regulations for the trophies, and the restrictions, are already there. As far as the poachers go, what we see is that, when you don't have that presence in these areas, the poaching increases. And so you have to have boots on the ground to deter poaching. And that's something that the trophy hunting operators do in many cases. And in some places like Qatada 11 do quite well. Referring to the report of economics at large, it is observed that little money actually reaches communities. What would you comment? I would say that, even less money reaches the communities from phototourism. It's very deceptive, to talk about, the fact that little money actually reaches communities. We have to understand, again, that this is a business, and that operators have overhead costs, and that, those overhead costs have to be paid in order to maintain those businesses and keep them viable. What reaches the communities is what, operators can afford to pay. Some operators, it costs them $1,500 or more a day just to stay in business. Meanwhile, they're charging their clients $2,000 a day because that's, the price point that the clients will tolerate. Well, that $500 has to be spread out, among staff, among the communities, among, other fixed costs that they have. So I would say, don't look at the total amounts. You have to look at the business operation as a complete picture, and then, look at what's actually reaching the communities. I would also encourage not focusing strictly on the communities. The communities have rights, with regard to these natural resources. That's absolutely established. But, these hunting operators are also purchasing rights as well. And they're entitled to profit from those investments as much as the communities are. Does research show that areas having trophy hunting report a lesser rate / number of animals poached? In many places, yes. If you look at Qatada 11 in Mozambique, Mozambique has had a terrible elephant poaching problem. Qatada 11 has become one of the few places in Mozambique where elephants are not being poached. And it's because of the anti-poaching program that's funded by trophy hunting dollars. Oftentimes, we'll see corruption, taking root in some of the, the agencies in places where trophy hunting is not allowed. But because, in places like Qatada 11, the jobs of the anti-poaching units actually depend on producing outcomes, which can be very different from public sector employees. There's much more efficacy, in their efforts. So yes, we do see lower rates of poaching in places where trophy hunting is allowed, and it's also because small returns or no, regardless of the size of the returns, the communities remain invested in the health of those animal populations. There's an opportunity cost to engaging in poaching, or in allowing poaching, because, poaching will deter hunting clients from coming in. And at the end of the day, you'll make more money from having the hunting available in your community than you will allowing a criminal element to come in and take the animals. How do you see the role of the IUCN in this strategy of conservation? Well, the IUCN, has long recognized the value of sustainable use to the conservation of wildlife. The IUCN is not alone in that. The Convention on Biological Diversity recognizes the value of sustainable use, and the CITES is based around the role of sustainable use in the conservation of biodiversity. So I think the role of the IUCN, as a body of experts, a body of practitioners, a body of people who have, direct experience in the field, with the subject matter, is to talk about what is. And again, the science and the research is relatively settled on the question of whether or not trophy hunting and other forms of sustainable use provide value to conservation efforts. And I think the IUCN has a role to state that, and to make sure that decision makers and policymakers and the general public are aware of these findings. Does trophy hunting include hunting of threatened animals too? If so, how can that problem be overcome? In some cases, yes, it does. And because trophy hunting has placed a cash value on those threatened animals, we're actually seeing them recover as a result. Again, the southern white rhino was down to about 800 individuals in the late 1960s. And because of trophy hunting and the cash value placed on those animals, we're now approaching 20,000 in number. The bontabuk in South Africa is another example, where limited regulated trophy hunting and the cash value that extends to the animal as a result of that has encouraged people to conserve the habitat, has encouraged people to desire more numbers of that animal where otherwise they might not have. So it can be a tool in helping to recover species that are in decline. Since trophy hunting was reintroduced in Namibia, we've seen the elephant numbers there more than double in size. So it definitely creates an economic incentive for the recovery of threatened and endangered species if it's managed appropriately. And that's a key caveat, I think. Although your view at animals bringing funds to Africa is quite viable, how do you know that is being insured across the region? Because there's audits that are done. A lot of these programs do have a public component at some scale. Even where we have parastatal enterprises, those parastatals are ultimately accountable to a ministry. They're also accountable, in other ways to trade associations, to community leadership, to others. And we do find gaps. Sometimes things are not working out as they should, but that's the nature, of any industry. Nothing's ever going to be perfect. And when you find those gaps, you make the necessary adjustments to your programs and policies to try to fill those gaps. It's not a static process. It's not a static system. It's one that you're continually improving upon. Culture, Aboriginals, and ancestors, do they still holding importance than conservation? Any alternative source of employment for traditional hunting communities? I think the answer is yes. Alternative sources of employment are key, for any number of reasons, from rural economic development to counter poaching, to public health, to a whole host of things that provide social goods. Again, in Katada 11, they've begun developing alternative sources of employment for the communities that they live with. And I think, we have to respect these communities and we have to respect their cultures. In some cases, the hunting quotas that are established are shared with the communities because those communities do have a hunting culture. There's lots of options out there. There's lots of ways to address this issue. Does trophy hunting have unintended consequences? For example, hunting and trade of pangolin was legal and regulated to a certain extent, but has led to this pandemic. I'm going to push back on that a bit. We don't know that the pangolin is responsible for this pandemic, although that was widely reported at the outset. What we've seen in the peer-reviewed research that's been published so far, at least the ones that the research that I've seen, is that the first case of COVID-19 emerged in Wuhan in November of 2019, and it emerged in a person who had no contact with the market where the outbreak was first documented. There's no evidence suggesting that the first case, the first patient 0, had any contact with pangolin. Similarly, recent genomic sequencing of COVID-19 has shown that the virus emerged in an animal that likely has a high population density. Pangolins do not have a high population density. This is why researchers are now looking more and more at bats as the likely vector, through which this disease originated. Now, can it have unintended consequences? Yes, everything has second and third order effects. I think one of the unintended consequences on the positive side, is the rural community development aspect and the benefits for public health. The fact that trophy hunting dollars are being used to build rural clinics that can serve as the early warning system for pandemics, as well as provide people immediate medical care. That they're providing clean water, which can be essential to something as simple as washing our hands, which we know is important right now, but which many people, as I'm sure many of you are aware, do not have access to. A moral point to consider: would you be okay with auctioning off the right to kill an inmate who is on death row to raise money for improving prisons? I find that question utterly offensive. I think that it's an equivalency that is absolutely repugnant, and it's just not one that I'm going to entertain. Although your view at animals bringing funds to Africa is quite viable, we just answered that one. Are there any international conventions which restrict trophy hunting? Yes, to a degree. The Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, aka CITES, does not restrict trophy hunting per se, but what it does is place sideboards on the extent to which species, many of which are hunted, can be traded internationally. And that does create de facto restrictions, because a country only gets so many permits to export so many animals. And that does limit the extent to which trophy hunting can occur in practice.
I am sorry for the interruption. I think we're just running out of time. Due to paucity of time, we cannot take any more questions. We do have, many questions. Yeah. Catherine, I apologize for that interruption.
No worries.
Yeah, we have a paucity of time, and I think it has been a wonderful conversation. I think the best way to gauge a conversation is the number of questions asked and answered, and we have had a wonderful conversation on that part. I'd like to thank you for joining us in this conversation, and on behalf of Center for Civil Society, we appreciate your presence and your acceptance of our invitation for this.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I've enjoyed speaking with you all, and I wish you good health and security in this trying time. Thank you so much. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to
appreciate and thank Property and Environment Research Center for the work they're doing on free market environmentalism. And I'd also request our participants to go check the website of Property and Environment Research Center and for their support. Quickly, I just add that we have a feedback form that we have sent on the chat box. We will keep this meeting room open for like